Good afternoon. Welcome to Deadly Days, Tales of Dark Fantasy. Today, this is episode number 80. I missed last week, but I'm back in the saddle here trying to do things. This is from Der Orchidengarten. I can't really see that. Uh, the world's first illustrated fantasy magazine printed in Germany, in German, back in 1919, I believe it was. Yep, 1919. And I've actually translated and published the first year of this magazine. I'm hoping to translate more of them. However, there's kind of a holdup by the person who is doing the layout for me. They've recently moved and they've got other things going on. So let me just say I've got I've got two issues that I've already translated that I'm waiting on. So I'm not going to be translating anymore till I get those two, the layout done and have them out. I'm not sure when that's going to be. I'm not rushing anybody. And there's plenty of other projects that I can be working on. So anyway, this story is Orchids by Otto T. Kloot. Orchids grew in the jungle. Their forms were curved, tinkling like the milk of a mare. Shadows of deep purple crystal soon lightened. Then once more they clinked softly, trembling like the stream that comes out of wounded brains. Their hearts beat demurely. They floated on beautifully bent stems, whispering and flickering like the burning wood in fireplaces on dead hot nights. The light crackled and sputtered. Tremendous thunder crashed. In an instant, the air hummed like the wings of the golden dragons that fly across cold, vaporless oceans. They have spurs like the riders of death. They have jagged trains that flare and float down invisible halls. Rooster combs, blue chiseled helmets, like those of cassowaries, thin, drooping lips, like those of misers. Perfume drips from them, slow, heavy, piercing perfume. Insects drink from them and hover in the air like a condensation of siren green, indigo, and like gold. There are even birds, tiny, magically fast birds with happy, delicate, and long curved beaks. Once a woman passed by them just before nightfall. She was black and shiny as jet. Her large, luminous eyes were looking at the milky ground. Then a trembling and sighing stirred the brooding bodies of the orchids. They bowed on their long, vigorous stems, opened their wombs, and exhaled a sultry yellow dust, a sweet, mild, cloaking fragrance that poured over the woman's hair. The woman went from them to her hut that stood near the water. It was overgrown with the fleshy, pink and green, giant, oily leaves that cast motionless shadows. A man stood within them and fished. "Give me a fish," said the woman. He lifted the hook. The hook was empty. "Not yet," he called back. She stood there, her large, round, sleepy eyes turned toward the jungle. The dust glittered in her hair. Her breasts became high and full. The vertebrae in her neck pressed outward. Give me a fish, she cried again. He raised the fishing rod. A little fish hung on the end of the line, which he threw back. Later, he called back. She bent down and ran her hand over the serrated leaves of a giant sunflower. Give me a fish, she called for a third time. He lifted the swaying rod. A powerful fish dangled there, flipped over the line and snapped it. Patience, he shouted, looking at the fish as it disappeared back into the water. Languidly, her lips swaying, she stepped up behind him. Her eyes were icy, like those of a snake. She stretched out her arm. A knife glinted in her hand. Give me a fish, she cried, trembling from her head to her toes. He swung the fishing pole out of the water and saw that a slender, magical-colored fish flashed on the broken, hookless line. Here, he called, bending down. Then her knife struck him in the heart. She drove the knife into his heart, through the back, beneath the throbbing ribs. Patience, she shouted in an overbearing voice. Her bare foot struck him so that he fell into the water with a painful scream. A fine wind blew her hair, her hot, terrifying hair. A sultry yellow dust flickered inside it. She turned and looked back at the jungle, from which no sound came, not even the slightest sound. That night, the animals screamed in the forest so that the pitch fell from the trees. But as the sun rose, it became quiet. It was the hot silence of an open grave that steamed upwards toward heaven. The sluggish, slimy water oozed into the jungle, where the steely leaves of the rattan palms rang deeply. Sparkling orchids arched over the head of the dead man like wreaths of fire. They clustered in bunches, stars, tufts, and crowns, shimmering with salves, cool as ivory, flaring with colors beneath the flouncing dance of the sun. They silently gathered in such masses, head to head as if they were dying. From out of the slit seams of their robes protruded necks, stained with blood. Their breasts did not sleep, as they dreamed new forms in which they would arise, new masks in which to cover themselves. Beneath them in the water floated the corpse of a man. It rotated and then spun. A wave lifted his face above the water. He was black. The dark surface of his forehead and cheeks reflected the swaying colors. The orchids dreamed delicately. They swayed downward, then swayed back up. Their lips paled. They were like sunsets whose shimmering oscillations dipped into the sea. Stripes blazed on their hips like those of tigers. They leaned over the parapet into the sky, and their hidden eyes foamed white beneath their lids like shy steeds. The man in the water rose out of the slimy tide. His legs were long and thin. From out of his back, under the fourth rib, protruded the handle of a knife. The tip was hidden in his breast, whose throbbing was audible throughout the deep, fearful world of the orchids. "Give me a fish," stammered the man. The water slowly slid off his porous skin, honey-laden water, spread out over the growth and the motionless, giant, oily leaves. The shameful womb of one of the flowers opened its eyelash. A little fish glided out, magically colored, thin as the edge of a dwarven spear. "Patience," murmured the orchids. The man took the little fish and pressed it to his heart. Mysterious blossoms crowded onto his head, a sound like breaking glass. The wound in his back began to bleed, sad red drops. He put his hand there, then pulled it back and looked at it, mumbling. The claws of his fingers dug into the little fish and squashed it. Patience, murmured the orchids. Then from out of the woods came a harsh, horribly loud scream. He reached up, pulled the tendrils down, and stripped the flowers from the stems. His muscles twitched. His heart pounded. Baring his teeth, he bit his lips so that the blood gushed out. Thousands of eyes, shamefully violet, irritatingly sweet, sharp, bright eyes full of light floated up and then floated back down. And the distant, dark voice, black and shiny as jet, became louder and more plaintive. His eyes began to roll terribly. His limbs glimmered and sparkled like reeds in a jungle fire. The knife jumped out of the wound. Rebounding tendrils grasped for it, flung it up so that it floated like a star beneath the palm trees. Wherever he reached, they trickled onto his hands like sheets in the moonlight, where he touched them. Their lips parted with nipple-like slits. Eyelashes and patches of color bloomed, creating ever wilder forms, increasingly bizarre masks. Creatures of icy wax, cruel and silently trembling. He fell. They pulled him back up. He stretched out his arms. They lay upon him, weightless, stifling, shining with brilliance, like heaps of modern silk. The light soaked into the eager leaves. They buzzed and whizzed, lying on him, drinking. He was stuck there like an insect. His limbs became shrunken. His bronze body withered. His face became long and drooped down like slime. Outside the wall of blossoms came the cracking of running feet. As they turned as if moved by a singular force, rigid, shameful, without blood, passionless, thousands of them. Through their weaving breasts, like through a metal sieve, you could see his blood, red, wide-open mouth, his cheeks, chin, and the threads of skin hanging down. A woman ran past. She ran all around the dome of flowers, her hands beneath her swaying breast. Patience, the orchids murmured. She howled. She pulled out her hair. Patience, the orchids murmured. She bit her hands. Give me a fish, she screamed. Then they spit out his eyes in front of her, then his hair, his teeth, his tongue, scraps of his limb, black as ebony wood. Then the little fish that was crushed, the magically colored scales shimmered. Then his heart. There was a knife in it. A handle protruded from a clean slit, round, slightly sticky. Incredible bitterness saturated the air, a sultry sweet perfume lusting after death. The woman reached for the heart, but her hands would not open. She stretched out her arms, squeezed convulsively, but her arms would not close. She hung over it. She wanted to cry. She wanted to scream. Immense, shiny black tears came, but her eyes were like those of the plants, oily, pink, and green, swarming with animals that slowly, thread-like, in loathsome greed, surged forward. Not a strand of her hair moved anymore, not the nostrils of her nose, nor the eyelashes of her eyes. Her breath was like sweet, hot, sultry yellow dust. Her body twitched in a horrible convulsion. Then it froze. "Give me a fish," murmured the orchids. "Patience," mumbled her mouth, and turned to stone. Her nudity sparkled, reflecting the fiery, covert, rotting colors of the orchids. Inside the wall of flowers fluttered scraps of skin that drooped and then dropped to the earth. "Not yet," murmured the orchids. "Not yet." Strange how plants and animals have been interwoven this night. The plants had teeth, delicate and silky, deadly greedy teeth, claws like those of a panther, fierce bodies that sated themselves on flesh. The animals inhaled the poison that they sucked out from the root of the blossoms. Terrible colors painted their softness. They grew silently on stems, and their lips moved violently, mysteriously fluttering and ragged, with 1,000 slits. And between them, 2 rotted bodies, black and shiny as jet, without mouths and without souls. The end. I've got to say, that is a strange story. Anyway, till next time. Thank you.